Well, um, so my name is John Travers. I graduated from the Turing School of Software and Design last month. And so I really got to know Ruby on Rails during my time there. And I really enjoyed learning about design patterns. So that's what I'm going to be talking about tonight. Yeah, so my talk is Design Patterns, the Key to Refactoring Rails MVC. So I want to start off by talking about Sandy Metz and her practical object-oriented design principles in Ruby. And her number one thing is changeability. So she said that changeability is the only design metric that matters, and that code that's easy to change is well designed. And so, yeah, it's very important. I think design patterns are a good way to create changeable code. So going back to old projects or whatever can be intimidating. And there are two main reasons why going back and refactoring can be hard. And the first one is that code can be messy. So if you have like a big code base or what have you, with lots of inner workings, and you haven't gone back and refactored before, perhaps, then it might be a little overwhelming. And so design patterns are a good way to create an organizational pattern for you to actually like recognize what to use in a certain circumstance. And then second of all, you don't really want to break anything. But if you haven't gone back and refactored, your code is probably pretty fragile. And hopefully you have a good test suite that tells you when things are broken so that you can fix them. And then you can use test-driven development to help you in that process. So there are tons of different design patterns, like so many. I was doing research for this talk and found so many. Two that I found very interesting when I was doing research and that I've used are the adapter and the decorator. So I'm going to go more in depth with those two, but I encourage you to go look into more of them. They're very interesting and there are specific use cases for each one, which I'm going to get into further. But I will preface this this talk with the fact that I am just out of a boot camp and that I am not the most experienced. I'm still learning. And so these are just things that I found in my own experience in research, and it might not be applicable to everything. So just take it with a grain of salt. We're all going to have different experiences with these things. So the first design pattern that I want to talk about is the adapter. And so as you see on the right, there's an electrical adapter, right, to plug a USB cord into a wall outlet. And so an adapter is just an interface for normally incompatible classes to work together. Just like a wall adapter allows a USB cord that normally wouldn't be plugged into a wall to be plugged into a wall. And so there are specific use cases for the adapter design pattern. Mostly when you're using gems or external libraries and APIs, and especially for legacy code bases. So when you have versions of gems that you need to swap out or things like that, it's a great use case for the adapter. So in the example on the right, you have a stock data provider providing your application, which let's say is just like a stock analysis application. It provides data in an XML format. And then you also want to use an analytics library that is that does everything in JSON. And so in order to do this, you need to have an adapter that converts things between XML and JSON. And without that, you can't really function. And so what this adapter does is it adds a layer of abstraction around external libraries. So this external analytics library, the adapter, the XML to JSON adapter, sort of like wraps around that external library and abstracts it so that it's easier to change in the future. So here we have something using Spotify. So let's say very simple, we just want to render JSON for searching a Spotify artist. And so this is the Tisk way of doing things. So you have an artist search controller, for example, with an index action. And then there's a Spotify client gem that provides you with this Spotify module and client class. And so you create a new Spotify client and then get the artist by using the Spotify client search method, passing in the artist parameter that's passed in from a form, let's say. And so here you just render the JSON for those artists. So what you're doing here is tying your controller to the Spotify client gem. And if you were to need to swap that out in the future, it would be more difficult to do so than abstracting it out into an adapter class. So here, the better way of doing it is creating a Spotify adapter here on the bottom, and then initializing and then when you initialize a Spotify adapter, it creates a new Spotify client. And in this case, the Spotify adapter is tied to that Spotify client gem, but you can easily swap it out in the future. And so here in the controller itself, the artist search controller, you use the Spotify client, which is actually a Spotify adapter, and then you search for artists using just that artist param. And so everything related to the gem that the gem is executing is abstracted into the Spotify adapter class. And so that makes it very easy to change in the future. And you could also, let's say that Spotify gave back JSON and your application works in XML, like the previous example. You could also have a method for converting to XML in the Spotify adapter to make it more compatible with your program. So the decorator is the other design pattern I want to talk about. And basically, a decorator extends the functionality of a class without altering its original structure. So here you see these two women on the right. They're decorating a fireplace. They're not changing the structure of the fireplace. They're just adding more things to it. And so the use case here is when you have presentation logic that differs from an object's built-in method or methods. So here you have this guy on the right, and he's cold, but then you add a wrapper around him, a jacket, and he has different properties. And then you add a raincoat, for example, and then he has the property that he's impermeable. So here, as an example, let's say you have a user that has a first name, a last name, an email, and a birthday. And then you have a user controller with a show method or a show action for, like, let's say user dashboard. And then what gets really hairy here, big yikes, is the view. And so you have a lot of presentation logic happening in the view. So you have user.firstname plus space plus user.lastname to get their full name. If the email is private, you display email private. And then otherwise you display the email. And then you're doing string formatting for the birthday in the view. And so having this kind of presentation logic in the view is not the best. So one way we can get out of that is by putting methods into the model itself, which is not great, double yikes. So here it is abstracted, so our view looks really nice now. We have user.fullname, user.protected email, and user.formatted birthday. And so here, full name, the same thing for protected email, so it returns private, and then it formats the string of the birthday in the way you want it for this particular view. The controller still looks really nice, but we've added a bunch of methods to our model that aren't maintainable in the future. So let's say you have like 10 different views, and each of them needs a slightly different version of these names and emails and birthdays. So you would need like a lot of, maybe like tens, hundreds perhaps of methods for these presentation logic. And so having those in your model just clutters everything, and it's not very maintainable in the future. So one way around this is using the decorator design pattern. And so it's a slick way of abstracting all of that extra presentation logic into its separate class. So here our user goes back to being very slim, the model. Our view still looks great, same as before. And then the only thing that changes in the controller is that we use a user decorator and pass in the user object. And so what a decorator does, like I said before, is it extends the functionality. So here we're using simple delegator to extend that functionality, which is a Ruby class that delegates all of the method calls on an object to a different object. So here we're passing in the user, and everything that's called on this user object is delegated to the user decorator. And so this full name method is called on the decorator and in the view, and it's used there. And so this abstracts all of your presentation logic into a nice class, and so that it's easily maintainable and changeable in the future. You only have to change it in one place. So those are the two design patterns that I wanted to talk about, but there are many, many out there. So I encourage you to go explore. One resource that I found very helpful is refactoring.guru. And it's just a website that goes through tons of different design patterns across multiple languages and frameworks, and breaks down what they are conceptually, as well as how to implement them. So that's a really cool resource. And in conclusion, design patterns help you make your code more maintainable. So I encourage you to look into them in the future. Yeah, here are my sources. And thank you all for listening. Are there any questions?
Somebody did have a question on the chat, Mike.
Oh, okay. One sec.
So yeah, Mike is asking, is there another name for view model that has become popular in mobile development?
View model.
I think
The decorator pattern you showed looks a lot like view models in Android and iOS. Have you come across any of that, or are people calling that decorators in the Ruby community?
Decorators. So they are called decorators in the Ruby community, from my knowledge, but I haven't done any mobile development, so I'm not sure about like the overlap there.
Mike, I'm like
if you'd like.
Mike, I'm like obsessive with the naming of these kinds of things because I work in this space at GitHub, and generally the term view model I've heard used to describe some code that is specifically coupled to the view.
Which is what he showed.
Like a decorator is coupled to the model. So like view singular. So like a view model would be like code that is supporting of a specific view. And a decorator is view related code that is shared across many views, but it's coupled to a specific model.
so you could use that in the email as well, Mike, is what he's getting. You could decorate your user and be like, oh,
I think we're splitting hairs, and
We are.
Well, but the name decorator is not a Ruby thing. That's an old one. That's in the original Gang of Four book on design patterns.
So here you go. I brought
Yeah.
opened up the can. Here we go.
By the way, this is printing. I picked up.
Upside the head with it.
Marty's literally throwing the book at us.
Yeah, there it is. The index shows the decorator.
And decorators right there. So yeah, these are all structural patterns from back in the day. This book, by the way, has C++ examples for you, those of you.
Russ Olson wrote a good book on Ruby patterns. I posted it in the chat.
Yeah, and I'm halfway through it right now. It's amazing.
Yeah, it's really good.
John, just to let you know, you're still sharing your screen. I'm not sure.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Yeah.
So that, Marty, what was the title of that book? Sorry.
Design patterns, elements of reusable object-oriented software. So Gamma, Helm,
Awesome.
Johnson, and
Felicities.
whatever.
Also known as the Gang of Four book.
Gang of Four. This is known as the Gang of Four book.
I think that book's like 40 years old, 50. How old is it now?
It was printed in '95 originally.
Originally? I thought it was older than that.
It was so popular that it used to be asked in interviews. That's what Russ Olson talks about in his kind of intro, is like you would be asked what your favorite pattern was when you were interviewing for software engineer jobs. Like, and you had to know, like it had to be one of the patterns in that book. Like that's how popular it was.
So just so you know, for refactoring, this is the original book that kicked off that process. Martin Fowler's refactoring book, published in 1999 as well.
The website for that book is remarkably complete with examples in JavaScript, which is kind of convenient.
Yeah.
If you don't want to like buy the textbook and let it sit on your shelf.
And this would, I will tell you that when I switched from Java to Ruby in, when was it, 2005? I found that a lot of my Java refactoring patterns just didn't work because it's just different. Ruby didn't need them exactly, or it didn't make sense. So I think that having a more modern language version of refactoring is probably the way to go.
Fowler wrote a book for that version of that for Ruby. So you get that book instead.
And I think that one's on sale right now, 55% off at Inform IT, if I'm recalling properly. Although I think that was published in 2010, Marty. I was a little worried about what the language version in Ruby would look like, although it's...
Yeah, it is. Yeah, this is J Field. This is 2010, yeah.
Yeah. I was looking at it, I was like, is that worth the investment, or is it? I'm sure it is, but it was still like...
Looks like Stefan's got a question.
Yeah, John, on the first pattern you talked about, you chose to you moved the adapter into that method where you then created it and that gave you access to the adapter, but you call the adapter, you chose to leave the name Spotify in there. And I find it to be an interesting question of whether, how would you choose whether that is now a music playback adapter or an artist finding adapter versus Spotify? So you chose Spotify. Is there anything that would make you drop that?
So I was under the impression that adapters should use whatever name, like the library you're using is, or the API that you're using. So that's why I called it the Spotify adapter. But you bring up a good point that it could be more general than that. Like it doesn't have to use the Spotify API or whatever, in the future. So yeah,
I think
that's an interesting point.
My question might make more sense when you look at something like authentication and you want to like start with one and then swap it out. And if you then go with like the provider, like, I don't know, AWS Cognito first and then Firebase or then something else, then you're constantly renaming the rest of the app. But if you go with the contribution that it makes to the app, namely auth, then it stays the same and you're only refactoring for that kind of what gets adapted inside of that thing. And that might give you more flexibility, but who wants to change away from Spotify? So in that case, it might not make as much sense.
It kind of can help you bring the prepper mindset to your applications. Something very relevant in these trying times. I worked at a company that I will not name, where the CTO was very paranoid about our payment processor changing our rates.
I know what I was talking about.
Mike, but we had an adapter pattern for payment processors. Of course, Mike. And I think it was rightfully so, because we were dealing with like millions of dollars. And the adapter pattern was actually like a really good mindset for us to be in as engineers, not just like from a code in the editor kind of way, but just like coming to terms with the fact that like we should not couple ourselves to a specific third party.
Yeah, I think the point is like, what's the cost of change when you need to make that change? If you have one.
The adapter also becomes really useful if you want to swap in and out multiple providers. So in the authentication example that Stefan uses, I could write an authentication interface, and I could just swap those things in and out. So the interface is actually the adapter, and you could literally give me 7 choices for logging in, and you would just pick an adapter based on what I selected. So Facebook, Google, GitHub, they all adhere to the same interface. Now in Ruby, you don't get interfaces, so implementing that in Ruby is a little more challenging.
You just get subclasses.
It's easier. It's easier in Ruby.
It's less type safe. Okay, not
type safe at all.
Sure.
We do something similar at TextDesk. We talk to Twilio or Bandwidth or a whole bunch of other providers, and we use their gems, or if they even provide a gem, but we have a client that maps to their API exactly. So we have a Twilio client and a Bandwidth client, but then we have a Twilio adapter and a Bandwidth adapter that all present the exact same interface to the rest of our app. So the app just needs to send a message and it grabs the right adapter and calls send message. And so like, even though we're not like worried about ever swapping them out in the future, like we just pick the right one and they all have the same API to the rest of the app, which is handy.
And I think just sort of like John's is the first good step, right? You're like, all right, I need to make a Spotify adapter. And then you're like, oh, I want to talk to Pandora. Let's make a music service adapter. And then it branches out to either of those two. And then you only have one adapter that talks to your front end, but then you can have multiple adapters to make these small little objects that can be branched off of. So what you're doing and showing, John, isn't wrong. That's not what we're trying to get at. It's there's just sort of approaches, and it depends. Like if you're only using one, then call it Spotify adapter. If you're using MailChimp and you want something else, call it like your newsletter or your email client manager.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Like I said, I'm still learning all of this, so this has been very helpful. Thank you.
No, it was a great presentation.
Thank you. We could bike shed probably all night and well into tomorrow.
This is why I didn't pick this type of topic. I didn't want to get no books thrown at me.
Yeah, but I'm really glad you gave an example of a user model and putting the extra methods into a decorator of the user, because in all of the apps, user's the one that blows up into a junk drawer of methods. And so to have a really simple example for a simple talk like this that highlights that on user, like it's a contribution to humanity, and thank you very much.
So maybe I'll stoke the flames a little bit since no one else seems to want to do it. What is the point of decorators when you have like, you're able to like include like concerns and whatnot in Rails? Like,
so are we really going to go there?
Ooh, that's a good question. I'm not entirely familiar with.
Damn it.
I guess this is just the lightning talk. Maybe we should move on.
That's a good question. I think decorators are easier to test in my experience as a separation.
Concerns have never been added to Rails. That is my opinion.
What did you say, Mike?
Concerns should have never been added to Rails. They are abused. They're the worst. Yes, you should just.
I can't decide what's worse in my experience. Concerns or decorators, though. That's the problem I'm having right now.
Active record lifecycle hook.
Which was most of Mike's talk last Build a Ruby meetup.
That was where Mike gave a Scala talk at a Ruby meetup.
I did post a link in the chat. It's a pretty old one. It's from Code Climate, and it's kind of goes down that rabbit hole of like avoiding fat models and 7 ways to decompose them. So it's not just adapters, because like Joel has pointed out, like you could just take out all your methods and throw them into an adapter and you're not in a better place, right? So this kind of gives you different examples, and I've found it very helpful over the years.
I think it's really important that you learn your options and you see different ways of extracting these things so that you can choose what makes sense for your app and where it's going.
I agree.
It's good to know what tools you have to reach for, and then it becomes easier as you kind of work towards refactoring and improving your code base. So it's great to just know those sorts of things. Okay, any more questions or discussion around this?
I had a question about the decorator. One of the reasons for using a decorator that was mentioned was an explosion, like a combinatorial explosion of different methods needed for different views. And I think using a decorator doesn't actually solve that. I think it just puts it in another place. Is that correct? Or maybe you could add more stuff to deal with that.
I think what you can do with a decorator.
You could.
Sorry,
Sorry.
I'll back off and let you answer, and then I'll offer another perspective.
Okay. So I think you could, I mean, again, I'm pretty new to this whole thing, so this is just an idea, but I think it would be possible to specialize your decorators based on your view if you had like a lot of presentation logic that you had to account for in order to like organize and clean things up. But that's just an idea. I'm not sure what the best practice is.
Yeah, I had sort of that idea also, like maybe add functionality for constructing different things that you might need in the view to the decorator. So instead of having, you have like functionality for different ways to render names, perhaps.
Yeah, you may have one view, for example, where you want to render the name with sort of the concatenation we saw in the example, but you have another view where you want to do first name, last initial. This is actually terrible because human names are hard, and like don't try to do that. Just use a plain string for the whole name. But the combinatorial explosion is your UI has all sorts of different ways that you want people to show up, and you don't want that to creep into your database. Like, and so if you can take some common pieces, and then for this page put the 3 pieces that matter for that page, for the way you're trying to show the user and how they're connected to a couple of other things maybe, and then on the other page where they're showing up next to their social network, you can show relationships differently there. And it's the ability to compose the parts together that makes them, I think, useful in the long run. And it becomes a tool that helps you organize your code, which, you know, comes back to Marty's point of knowing options and spending the time to think about how you really want to carve things up.
Thanks.
All right. I think that's a good kind of stopping point. Does anybody, let's see.